My father-in-law's chair was still warm when they told me to leave. I noticed it the moment I stepped through the door of the cottage, my boots still wet from standing at the graveside in the March sleet. Walter had always kept that chair angled toward the window so he could watch the lake, even in winter when the ice came in and the herons disappeared. My husband was sitting in it now, leaning back the way Walter never did, one arm draped over the side like the chair had always been his. My brother-in-law Craig was on the couch beside a woman I didn't recognize, young, with a leather portfolio open on her knees. Craig's wife Sandra stood near the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee she must have made herself from Walter's kitchen, in Walter's mugs, the morning we buried him. I stood in the doorway. Snow was still melting off my coat and onto the mat Walter had bought at the Penetanguishene hardware store 12 years ago, the one that said "Welcome in," faded green letters. "Close the door, Dorothy," Glenn said. "You're letting the cold in." He didn't stand up. He didn't look at me the way a husband looks at his wife when they've just buried his father. He looked at me the way a landlord looks at a tenant who is slightly late on rent. I closed the door. I had driven back from the cemetery alone because Glenn had ridden with Craig. I'd assumed it was because Craig needed the company, or because there were things brothers needed to say to each other on a day like this. I know now it was because they needed the time to go over what they were about to do. The young woman with the portfolio introduced herself. She said she was an articling student with a firm out of Barrie, there to help facilitate the reading of Walter Harrington's last will and testament. She was polite about it, professionally blank, the way people are when they're doing something uncomfortable for money. "Can I at least hang up my coat?" I asked. Craig cleared his throat. "This won't take long." I hung my coat on the hook by the door. Walter's coat was still on the hook beside mine. His green fishing vest, the one I'd sewn a new zipper onto last June because he couldn't manage buttons anymore with his hands the way they were. I made myself look away from it. I sat on the footstool near the fireplace because it was the only seat left in the room, in my own home. In the home I had not left for more than 4 days at a stretch in 8 years. The articling student opened her portfolio. "Walter had amended his will," she said. 14 months ago. The cottage and all its contents, along with his investment accounts, his RRSP, and his savings totaling approximately $640,000, were to be divided equally between his 2 sons, Glenn and Craig. She paused. To Dorothy Harrington, for her years of assistance, a bequest of $3,000. I looked at Glenn. He was studying the fireplace. $3,000. 8 years. 8 years of being the only one who stayed. I want to be precise about what those 8 years looked like, because it matters, and because no one in that room was going to say it. Walter's wife, my mother-in-law Rose, died of a heart attack in the spring of 2016. She went quickly, which Walter always said was a mercy, and which I suspected also meant he never quite believed it had happened. He stayed in the cottage year-round after that, which he'd never done before, because he said he didn't know what to do with himself in the city without her. Glenn was working in Toronto. Craig had moved to Vancouver a decade earlier and came back for Christmas if the flights were reasonable. I was the one who drove up from Barrie every 2 weeks at first, then every week, then more. Walter had his first small stroke in the fall of 2017. His balance went. His handwriting changed. He started leaving the stove on. Glenn said it made sense for us to move in with him. We'd been talking about leaving the city anyway. The mortgage was killing us. The cottage had 3 bedrooms and a wood stove and a dock on the lake. It made sense, Glenn said. And it did make sense, at the time. What Glenn said less clearly was that he would be commuting back to Toronto 3 or 4 days a week for work, and then 5, and then staying over because the drive was brutal in winter, and then coming up on weekends, and then every other weekend, and then I stopped tracking it. By 2019, I had stopped taking on any bookkeeping clients because I couldn't reliably be away from the cottage for more than a few hours. Walter's second stroke left his right side weaker and his memory unpredictable. He knew me every day, which the doctors said was something. He called me Rosie sometimes in the evenings when he was tired, and I never corrected him. He knew I was someone who loved him, and that was enough. Craig called on Sundays. Sometimes. Sandra sent a poinsettia at Christmas. Glenn came when he could, which I understand now was a different thing from coming when Walter needed him. I changed Walter's dressings. I managed his medications, which by 2021 numbered 11. I drove him to his appointments in Barrie and later in Aurelia when his cardiologist moved practices. I sat with him through 2 procedures, holding his hand because he asked me to, and because there was no one else. I learned to make his meals soft enough that he wouldn't choke. I learned to read his face when the pain was bad and he was trying not to say so. I learned to sit quietly beside him in the evenings and just be present, which is harder than it sounds and which he needed more than anything. In February, 2 weeks before he died, Walter had a clear afternoon. It happened sometimes near the end, a window opening in the fog. He was sitting up in bed with the light coming off the lake, and he reached out and took my hand. "Dorothy," he said, and his voice was his own voice, not the thin, careful voice he used when he was working to find words. "I need you to listen to me." I sat on the edge of his bed. "My boys are not going to do right by you," he said. "I know that. I know what they're like. I knew what Glenn was like before you did, and I'm sorry I didn't warn you." "Walt, don't!" He squeezed my hand, surprising me with the strength of it. "I've had a long time to think about this, and I need you to hear me. There's an envelope in my top drawer, under my Korean War medal. Don't open it until after I'm gone. Promise me." I promised him. "I'm sorry Rose isn't here," he said after a moment. "She would have loved you properly. She would have made sure you knew." I didn't ask what she would have made sure I knew. I thought I understood, and I didn't want to cry in front of him. He died on a Tuesday. Quietly. At 4 a.m, with the lake still dark outside his window. I was the one sitting with him. I had asked Glenn to come back from Toronto that week, told him it was close, and he had said he'd drive up Thursday. He drove up the day after. Now I sat on Walter's footstool and listened to a stranger tell me I was worth $3,000. "That's not the will Walter described to me," I said. The articling student looked at her papers. "Mom," Glenn said, and he never called me Mom. It was a reflex, a way of softening something. Dad was on a lot of medication at the end. His memory was fine when it needed to be. I looked at my husband. He was clear. He told me himself what he intended. "There's nothing in the document except the bequest," the articling student said carefully. She seemed uncomfortable. I noted that. Craig leaned forward. "Look, Dorothy, we know this isn't ideal, but the document is clear and the estate is straightforward. Glenn and I have agreed we're going to sell the property. There's a buyer interested already, someone from the city, cash offer. We'd like to get the listing cleaned up before the spring market, so we're asking if you could be out by the end of the month." "The end of the month? 26 days. Where exactly?" I said. "Do you expect me to go?" "That's not really our responsibility to figure out," Sandra said from the kitchen counter. She said it pleasantly, the way people say things they've been rehearsing. I sat there for a moment longer. I looked around the room. The shelf of Walter's books, the ones I'd reorganized last year so he could reach them from his chair. The water stains on the ceiling I'd reported to Glenn twice and fixed myself in October with a tube of sealant from the Canadian Tire in Midland. The photographs on the mantel, the one of Walter and Rose on their honeymoon in Banff, the one of Glenn and Craig as boys at this same lake, the one of me and Walter sitting on the dock the summer before he had his second stroke, both of us laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. No one had moved that photograph. It was still there. I stood up. "I understand," I said. "I think they expected something else. I think they had prepared for a scene, for accusations, for the kind of desperate performance that would let them feel justified in what they were doing." Glenn looked almost disappointed. I went upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Glenn for the last 8 years. The bedroom where I'd lain awake so many nights listening through the baby monitor for Walter's breathing, where I'd learned to wake at the smallest sound and be down the hall in 30 seconds. I took my suitcase from the closet. I packed what I needed. I packed the small cedar box Walter had given me on my 60th birthday, the one he'd carved himself with shaking hands and had been working on for 6 weeks. I packed the photograph from my bedside table, me and Walter on the dock. I packed the envelope from his drawer, still sealed, the way I'd promised, and I packed the key. The key had been tucked inside the envelope, which I had not opened, but the shape of it had been visible through the paper, and I had known it was there for 2 weeks. The way you know something is true before you let yourself look directly at it. I drove to the Comfort Inn on the highway south of Midland. It was the off-season, and the room was $49 a night, which was good because I had access to a joint account that Glenn could theoretically freeze, and my own savings account with about $4,000 in it, and the $3,000 the estate had apparently decided I was worth. I sat on the bed with my coat still on. I did not open the envelope that night. I had promised Walter, and my promise had been that I would open it after he was gone, which he was. But somehow sitting in that room with the highway noise outside and the smell of industrial cleaning fluid everywhere, I felt I needed one more day. One more day of not knowing. One more day of him still having done something for me, somewhere, that I hadn't seen yet. I ordered Swiss chalet delivery because it was the only thing open that late and because Walter had loved their quarter chicken dinner. I ate it sitting on the bed watching the Weather Channel. It was supposed to snow again Thursday. In the morning, I opened the envelope. Inside was a key on a paper tag. The tag said, Meridian Credit Union, Barrie, Box 447, and a note in Walter's handwriting, the careful printing he'd switched to when cursive became too difficult. Dorothy. I know my boys. I have known them longer than you have, and I love them, but I know what they are. I went to see a lawyer last spring, a woman named Patricia Okafor, on King Street in Barrie. I took the bus on a Tuesday when my head was clear. I told her everything, and she helped me do this properly. The real will is in the box. So is the recording. Call Patricia. Her number is in the box. I'm sorry you have to go through this. You deserved better from all of us. I'm grateful every day that you stayed. Love, Walter. I read it 3 times. Then I called the number for Patricia Okafor and Associates. Her assistant answered. When I said my name, she said Miss Okafor had been expecting my call and could see me that afternoon. The office was on King Street in Barrie, above a physiotherapy clinic, in a building that smelled like coffee from the cafe on the ground floor. Patricia Okafor was perhaps 55, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the kind of unhurried competence that I recognized from the good doctors Walter had seen over the years. She stood to shake my hand and gestured to the chair across from her desk. Mrs. Harrington, she said, I'm very sorry for your loss. Walter was a remarkable man. You met him? 3 times. The first time last April, when he came in on his own to discuss his estate. The second time in June, when we executed the will. The third time in September, when he came back to confirm everything was in order and to leave an additional document. She folded her hands on the desk. He was assessed for capacity at each visit. I have a letter from his physician confirming he was of sound mind at the time of the June execution. I was thorough because he told me to be. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that his sons would try something and that he wanted it bulletproof. She unlocked the metal box on the table between us. Inside was a sealed envelope, a USB drive, and a folder thick with documents. Walter's official will, she explained, had been executed on the 14th of June of the previous year, witnessed by herself and 2 colleagues, notarized, filed with the court. She began to read. The cottage and its contents were mine. Not Glenn's, not Craig's. Mine. His TFSA and his investment accounts, totaling approximately $380,000, were mine. Glenn and Craig each received $40,000 on the condition that neither of them contested the will. If either of them challenged it, they received nothing. His fishing gear, specifically, went to the Penetanguishene Legion for their youth outdoor program because Walter had been proud of that program and wanted it on record. I put my hand flat on the table to steady myself. They showed me a different will, I said. An articling student read it. It left everything to Glenn and Craig and gave me $3,000. Patricia Okafor's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it sharpened. Do you still have a copy? They kept it. That's all right. Can you describe it? Who signed it? Who witnessed it? What date it was on? I told her what I remembered. The date on the document had been October of last year, 7 months after the real will had been executed. A fraudulent will executed after the genuine one, she said. In Canada, that's a serious matter. Forgery of a testamentary document is a criminal offense under the Criminal Code. Depending on what they can prove about intent, we may be looking at fraud charges as well. My husband, I said, and I stopped because I wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. I understand. She slid the folder toward me. There's more. Walter kept records. He documented every visit Craig made, which he counted. He documented every time Glenn didn't come. He kept a log of his care, who provided it, when, what it involved. His palliative care nurse made a statement. The staff at the Aurelia cardiology office made a statement. His GP made a statement. Every one of them identifies you as the primary and, in most cases, sole caregiver. She turned the laptop on the table toward me and inserted the USB drive. Walter's face filled the screen. He was sitting in this office, in the chair I was sitting in now, wearing the flannel shirt I'd ironed for him last Christmas. He looked tired in the way he always looked at the end, but his eyes were clear and his voice, when he spoke, was his own. "My name is Walter James Harrington," he said to the camera. "I am 83 years old and I am of sound mind, even if my body has other opinions." He paused. A Walter pause, the kind that meant he was choosing his words. "I want to speak clearly about my estate and about my daughter-in-law, Dorothy Harrington, because I believe my sons will attempt to contest my wishes after I am gone, and I want there to be no ambiguity about what those wishes are." He looked directly into the camera. "Dorothy came to live with me in the fall of 2017. She did not have to do this. She chose to do this because she is a person who does not walk away from people who need her. Over the following 8 years, she gave me the kind of care I cannot fully describe. She kept me safe. She kept me dignified. She sat with me through things that were not dignified at all, and she never made me feel ashamed." His voice caught slightly. "My wife Rose would have recognized her immediately as the kind of person she herself was. That is the highest compliment I know how to give." He shifted in the chair. "My sons are my sons and I love them. But they made their choices. They chose distance. They chose convenience. They chose to trust that someone else would handle what they couldn't be bothered with. That someone was Dorothy. The least I can do is make sure she is not left with nothing to show for it." He looked at the camera again. "If Glenn or Craig are watching this, I am not senile. I was not manipulated. This is what I want. If you challenge it, you will receive nothing, and you will do it in full view of a courtroom that will hear exactly what kind of sons you were to me. I hope you'll think carefully about that." A small silence. "Dorothy, if you're watching this, thank you. You gave an old man his dignity and his company and his lake view for 8 years. I hope you enjoy that dock for the rest of your life. I hope the herons come back in April the way they always do. I hope you'll be there to see them." The video ended. Patricia Okafor handed me a box of tissues and did not say anything while I used them. I appreciated that. "What happens now?" I asked when I could speak. "Now I file the genuine will with the Ontario Superior Court for probate. I send formal notice to all named parties, and I would strongly advise you to contact the OPP about the fraudulent document, because that is a police matter, and it should be on record regardless of whether you choose to pursue it. Will it hold up? The genuine will is airtight. The video is extraordinary evidence. The contemporaneous medical documentation of Walter's capacity is thorough beyond what most estates have. And the no contest clause is enforceable in Ontario." She leaned back slightly. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Harrington. I have been practicing estate law for 22 years. I have rarely seen an individual take these kinds of precautions to protect someone. Walter Harrington knew exactly what he was doing and he was meticulous about it. Your position is very strong." I drove to the OPP detachment in Barrie the next morning. The officer who took my statement was methodical and patient, a woman close to my age who asked clear questions and wrote down everything I said without editorializing. When I explained about the document Craig and Glenn had presented, she asked if I could describe the articling student who had attended. I described her. Young, professional, the portfolio, the firm in Barrie. The officer made a note. "We'll want to speak with her. She may have been used without full knowledge of what she was participating in, or she may be a witness to the preparation of the document. Either way," she looked up, "do not contact your husband or his brother. We'll be in touch with them directly." I did not contact Glenn. I drove back to the Comfort Inn. I ordered a pizza because it was Thursday, and Walter and I had always had pizza on Thursdays. It had been our ritual since the year the winter was very bad, and neither of us could face cooking. I ate it sitting at the small desk by the window, looking out at the parking lot and the gray sky and thinking about the lake. On the 6th day, Patricia Okafor called to tell me the probate filing had been accepted and formal notice had been sent. On the 8th day, I moved back into the cottage. My key still worked. I walked in through the back door, the one that stuck in the cold and that I'd shimmed last November with a piece of weather stripping, and I stood in the kitchen that was mine, legally and completely mine, and I put the kettle on. 2 hours later, a cruiser from the OPP pulled up the drive. I watched from the window as they knocked at the door of the shed where Glenn had been sleeping since he'd arrived back at the cottage 3 days earlier, apparently assuming I wouldn't be back. He came out in his work jacket, and I watched his face change as the officer spoke to him. Craig was arrested in Vancouver 2 days later by the RCMP. I was told this by phone. The articling student, it turned out, had not known the will was fraudulent. She had been hired through a legal temp service and had been given the document to read. Told it was routine, she cooperated fully with the investigation and was not charged. My son Glenn's son from his first marriage, who was 31 and lived in Ottawa, and with whom I had always had a careful, cordial, slightly uncertain relationship, called me the night after Glenn was arrested, Dorothy. He sounded as though he hadn't slept. Can I call you Dorothy? I've never actually asked. You can call me Dorothy, I said. I didn't know. His voice was tight. I want you to know that. I knew Dad and Craig were upset about Grandpa's will, but I didn't know what they were planning. Did you visit your grandfather? I asked. A pause. Not as much as I should have. No, I said. Not as much as he needed. Silence on the line. But you were in Ottawa, I continued. You had a life. You sent him cards. You called on his birthday. He kept the cards. I had found them in a shoebox in the closet, every birthday card going back 12 years. You were not responsible for your father's choices. I should have come more. Yes, I said, but you were 23 when we moved in with him, and then 24 and 25, and your grandfather always told you he was fine because that's what he did, told everyone he was fine. I paused. He was not fine, but that's also not entirely your fault. He came to visit the following month. He drove from Ottawa, which is a long drive in April, and he showed up with flowers that were too fancy for the cottage, tulips in a florist's cellophane, and stood on the porch, not quite knowing what to do with himself. I held the door open. I put the tulips in the one good vase. We sat at the kitchen table and I made tea, and he asked me to tell him about his grandfather. Not the careful, edited version. The real one. I told him about the winter Walter taught himself to paint watercolors because his hands weren't good enough for much else and he needed something to do. I told him about the morning Walter had laughed so hard at a CBC radio sketch that he'd knocked his tea off the tray. I told him about the evening Walter had said to me, out of nowhere, Dorothy, I think Rose sent you. She always did look after me better than I looked after myself. I told him about the dock in summer and the herons that came back every April to the same bay and that Walter called his herons and talked to as if they could hear him. He cried. He was not embarrassed about it, which I respected. Why didn't he tell me, he said, about the will, about what he'd done to protect you? Why didn't he say anything? Because he loved you and he didn't want to put you in the middle of something between your father and me. I wrapped my hands around my mug. And because he knew you weren't ready. None of you were ready to hear that someone else had been a better family to him than his own children had been. That's a hard thing to hear. He was trying to protect your feelings while also making sure I was protected. That was very like him. He nodded slowly. He left you something, I told him. I showed him the letter Walter had included with his personal effects, separate from the legal documents. A handwritten letter to his grandson, 2 pages, telling him the things grandparents want to say and don't always get around to. His grandson read it at the kitchen table, and I went outside to give him privacy and stood on the dock in my coat, watching the bay where the herons would come back in 3 weeks if the weather held. The court proceedings took 4 months. Glenn pleaded guilty to fraud and document forgery and received a conditional sentence of 2 years less a day to be served in the community, with conditions. Craig, who prosecutors felt had been more centrally involved in obtaining and commissioning the false document, received 18 months with 6 to be served in custody. The law in Canada around estate fraud has teeth when the evidence is clear, and Patricia Okafor had made sure the evidence was very clear. I did not attend the sentencing. I had said everything I needed to say in my victim impact statement, which I had written at the kitchen table looking out at the lake, and which had taken me 3 drafts and 10 days to get right. I did not sell the cottage. I thought about it. There were moments in that first year when every room carried something difficult. The chair by the window where Glenn had sat on the day he told me to leave. The shed where he'd slept those 3 days, as though the cottage were still his. The kitchen where Sandra had helped herself to Walter's coffee. But the cottage also had 8 years of other things. The corner of the living room where Walter and I had watched the Heritage Minutes when the television reception was good. The dock with Walter's chair still angled to see the herons. The windowsill where he'd lined up his watercolor paintings to dry, the ones I'd framed and hung in the hallway and would not take down. I stayed. I took the money from the estate and did what Walter would have recognized as a practical and slightly stubborn thing. I went back to school. Not full school. A professional development course through Georgian College, updating my bookkeeping certification because I had been good at that before and I could be good at it again. I took on 3 clients by the fall, small businesses in Midland and Penetanguishene, people who needed someone careful and reliable and who didn't mind driving to the cottage for meetings. I also started volunteering one afternoon a week at the Barry Hospital with a caregiver support program, sitting with families who were navigating what I had navigated, telling them what I knew, which was that it was harder than anyone would tell them and more important than most things, and that they would not regret it, even when it cost them everything. My grandson, I had started thinking of him this way, as my grandson, because Walter had treated him as a grandson, and I had been his family, which made the connection real, even if it wasn't. Blood came back in July with his girlfriend and helped me rebuild the section of dock that had heaved over the winter. We worked in the heat for 2 days and ate hamburgers off the barbecue that had been Walter's barbecue and listened to the radio the way Walter had always insisted the radio be on in summer. One evening he asked me if I would ever reconcile with Glenn. I looked at the lake. The herons had been back since April. They nested every year in the same marsh at the north end of the bay, and Walter had been right about them. They were his herons. They belonged to this place, and they came back without being asked. I don't know, I said. Does it matter to you? I thought about what Walter had written in the letter I'd found, tucked into the last of his watercolor paintings, the one of the dock in winter, which he must have slipped there months before he died. Dorothy, he had written, permission to stop making yourself small. Permission to stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided what you're worth. You have spent too many years being the person who holds everything together and receives nothing for it. You are 63 years old and you have a lake and a dock, and the herons come back every April. Build something for yourself now. You have earned it. All my love, Walter. It matters less than it used to, I said. My grandson nodded. He was learning, I thought, what his grandfather had learned late and wanted to pass on. That love is not a feeling, primarily. It is a practice. It is who stays when staying is difficult. It is who shows up when showing up costs something. Walter had been shown that in the last years of his life by someone who was not required to show it, and he had understood it, and he had done what he could to make it mean something. I turned 64 that September. My grandson drove from Ottawa with a lemon cake from the bakery on Elgin Street that he knew I liked, and we sat on the dock in lawn chairs in the September light that is different from summer light, quieter and more honest, and I watched a heron stand motionless in the shallow water at the edge of the bay, doing what herons do, being patient, being still, waiting for the right moment with a certainty that looks, from a distance, exactly like peace. I was not the woman who had been told she was worth $3,000. I was not the woman who had stood in the doorway of her own home and been looked through by the people she had fed and tended and stayed for. I was Dorothy Harrington, 64 years old, owner of a lakeside cottage on Georgian Bay, certified bookkeeper, Thursday pizza, volunteer, keeper of watercolors. Loved finally and thoroughly by a man who had known how to say so even after he was gone. That was more than I had thought to ask for, but I was glad to have the lake too.